The smell hit you first. Urine, feces, disinfectant that never quite worked, and underneath it all, something else, something rotting, something forgotten. But it wasn't just the smell that made visitors to Willowbrook State School want to run. It was the sounds, children crying. Not the normal cries of childhood, but something deeper, something broken. The wails of 5-year-olds who had learned that no one was coming to help them. And then there were the silences. The long, terrible silences from children who had simply given up. In 1965, a young medical student walked through these halls. For the first time, he saw children lying naked in their own waste. He saw teenagers rocking back and forth, their heads bloody from hitting the walls. He saw rooms packed with 60 children and just 2 attendants. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that some of these children weren't just victims of neglect. They were test subjects. For 15 years, from 1956 to 1970, doctors deliberately infected mentally disabled children with hepatitis. They fed them contaminated food. They injected them with live viruses. They turned human beings into laboratory rats. And the most chilling part, they called it progress. This is the story of how American medicine lost its Soland, how we almost never found out. Asterisk picture. America in 1955, Eisenhower in the White House. Rock and roll on the radio. Suburbs spreading across the landscape like a promise of the perfect future. But perfection has a price. And in 1950s America, that price was paid by anyone who didn't fit the mold. Mental disability was America's dirty secret. Families hid disabled children like shameful secrets. Society warehoused them in massive institutions, out of sight and out of mind. The message was clear. These weren't really people. They were problems to be solved, burdens to be managed. Willowbrook State School opened in 1947 on Staten Island, designed to house 4,000 children with intellectual disabilities. By 1965, it contained over 6,000. The overcrowding was catastrophic, but nobody cared enough to fix it. What they did care about was disease. Hepatitis was ravaging these institutions. The virus spread through contaminated food and water, through human waste, through the simple act of being human in an inhumane place. At Willowbrook, nearly 100% of residents would contract hepatitis within 6 months of arrival. For families, this was a nightmare. For Dr. Saul Krugman, this was an opportunity. Krugman was a pediatrician and virologist at New York University. He was also a man who believed that the ends justified any means. In 1956, he looked at the hepatitis crisis at Willowbrook and saw something beautiful, a perfect laboratory, thousands of test subjects who couldn't say no, parents desperate enough to sign anything, a captive population where he could control every variable. The medical establishment called him a pioneer. Parents called him their last hope. History would call him something else entirely. But here's what makes this story so haunting. Krugman wasn't a monster hiding in the shadows. He was a respected doctor, working at a prestigious university, publishing in the world's top medical journals. He won awards. He gave lectures. He was the future of American medicine. And that future was built on the broken bodies of children who couldn't fight back. Dr. Saul Krugman arrived at Willowbrook in 1956 with impeccable credentials and ambitious plans. Harvard-trained NYU faculty, author of dozens of medical papers. He specialized in infectious diseases in children, and he believed that sometimes you had to cause suffering to prevent it. The hepatitis situation at Willowbrook gave him the perfect cover story. "We're going to study this disease," he told parents. "We're going to find a way to protect your children." What he didn't tell them was how. Krugman's plan was elegantly simple and absolutely monstrous. He would deliberately infect healthy children with hepatitis, then study how the disease progressed. He would test different strains, different doses, different delivery methods. He would turn these children into living laboratories. But first, he needed permission. The parents who brought their children to Willowbrook were already broken. They had been told by doctors that their children were hopeless cases. They had been rejected by school after school, program after program. Society had made it clear, your child doesn't belong here. Willowbrook was often their last option, and Krugman knew how to exploit that desperation. Your child will probably get hepatitis. Anyway, he would tell parents, at least this way, we can control the conditions. We can monitor them closely. We can make sure they get the best possible care. He made it sound like protection, like love. The consent forms were masterpieces of medical doublespeak. They mentioned controlled exposure and natural infection, patterns. They talked about advancing science and protecting future generations. They made parents feel like heroes for sacrificing their children. What the forms didn't mention were the deliberate infections, the contaminated milkshakes, the fecal extracts fed to children who trusted their doctors to keep them safe. Krugman started small, just a few children in a special research ward, clean facilities, extra staff, better food. Parents saw their children thriving and spread the word. Dr. Krugman's unit was different. Dr. Krugman cared. More families signed up. More children entered the program. More victims for Krugman's grand experiment. The hepatitis studies began in earnest in 1956. Krugman and his team, led by Dr. Joan Giles, developed increasingly sophisticated methods of infection. They would take fecal samples from infected children, process them in the laboratory, then feed the concentrated virus to healthy subjects. They called it the Willowbrook cocktail. The children called it medicine. 5-year-old Michael Ritchie was one of the first. His parents had been told he would never be able to care for himself, never hold a job, never live independently. They brought him to Willowbrook, hoping for miracle. They got a nightmare instead. Michael was enrolled in Krugman's program within weeks of arrival. He was given the hepatitis cocktail disguised as chocolate milk. For days, he seemed fine. He played with the other children. He smiled at the nurse's dot. Then the virus took hold. Fever, vomiting, jaundice that turned his skin the color of old mustard. Michael stopped eating. He stopped playing. He lay in his bed, too weak to cry, while doctors took notes on his suffering. Subject exhibits classic acute hepatitis symptoms, Krugman wrote in his research notes. Excellent disease progression. For study purposes, Michael recovered. Most of the children did, but some didn't. And even the survivors carried scars that went deeper than their damaged livers. The research unit became a factory of infection. Children would arrive healthy and leave diseased. Parents were told this was necessary. Medical students were told this was progress. The outside world was told nothing at all. But Krugman was just getting started. By 1960, he had identified 2 distinct strains of hepatitis: infectious hepatitis, later called hepatitis A, and serum hepatitis, later called hepatitis B. This was groundbreaking research that would revolutionize our understanding of viral diseases. It was also research built on the deliberate infection of hundreds of children. Krugman needed more subjects, more variables, more ways to test the limits of human suffering in the name of scientific progress. So he expanded the program. New children were recruited constantly. The waiting list for Willowbrook was years long, but Krugman offered a shortcut. Enroll your child in the research program, and they could be admitted immediately. For desperate parents, it seemed like a blessing. We can get Johnny in right away, they would tell each other. Dr. Krugman has a special program. They had no idea what special really meant. The infections became more systematic. Children were divided into groups based on age, severity of disability, and previous hepatitis exposure. Some received concentrated virus in food, others got injections. Still others were simply housed with infected children and allowed to contract the disease naturally. Every method was carefully documented. Every symptom was recorded. Every child became a data point in Krugman's growing database of human suffering. The medical journals loved it. In 1961, Krugman published his first major paper on the Willowbrook studies in the Journal of the American Medical Association. The research was hailed as groundbreaking. Medical schools began teaching Krugman's findings. Other researchers requested samples of his virus strains. Nobody asked about the children. The parents who visited the research unit saw clean facilities, an attentive staff. They saw their children receiving what appeared to be excellent medical care. Many believed they had made the right choice. They didn't know about the deliberate infections. They didn't know about the experimental protocols. They didn't know that their trust was being weaponized against their own children, and Krugman made sure they never would. Hospital records were kept strictly confidential. Parents received only sanitized reports about their children's natural disease progression. Medical staff were instructed never to discuss the research methods with families. The conspiracy of silence was complete, but secrets this dark have a way of surfacing, and by the mid-1960s, cracks were beginning to show in Krugman's carefully constructed facade. Dr. William Bronston was 23 years old when he first walked into Willowbrook as a medical student in 1965. Nothing in medical school had prepared him for what he found: children lying naked in pools of their own waste, teenagers with untreated injuries, their wounds infected and festering, rooms so overcrowded that children slept on the floor, their bodies pressed against each other like sardines in a can. But it was the research unit that haunted him most. These children looked different. Bronston would later recall. They were cleaner, better fed, but there was something in their eyes, a kind of learned helplessness that was even deeper than what I saw in the general population. Bronston began asking questions. Why were some children in the research unit while others weren't? What kind of research was being conducted? Why did so many healthy children develop hepatitis shortly after admission? The answers he received didn't add up. We're studying natural disease progression, Dr. Giles told him. These children were going to get hepatitis anyway. We're just documenting what happens. But Bronston was young enough to still believe in truth. He started digging deeper. He reviewed medical records. He interviewed staff members. He talked to parents during visiting hours. Slowly, a horrifying picture began to emerge. Children were being deliberately infected with hepatitis. The research was actually systematic human experimentation. The consent forms were lies wrapped in medical jargon. Bronston took his concerns to the administration. He was told to mind his own business. He took them to the New York State Department of Health. He was told that Dr. Krugman's research had been thoroughly reviewed and approved. He took them to the media. He was told that no one would believe him without proof. So Bronston started documenting everything. He smuggled out medical records. He took photographs. He recorded conversations with staff members who were willing to talk. What he found was worse than anyone had imagined. The hepatitis experiments weren't just about studying disease progression. Krugman was testing experimental treatments, trying different infection methods, and deliberately exposing children to multiple strains of the virus to see what would happen. Some children were infected multiple times. Others were given experimental gamma-globulin injections that sometimes worked and sometimes made their symptoms worse. Still others were used as control subjects, deliberately kept from receiving any treatment so researchers could compare their outcomes to treated children. Every child was a guinea pig. Every outcome was data. Every moment of suffering was justified as scientific progress. But the most damning discovery was yet to come. In 1967, Bronston gained access to internal research documents that revealed the true scope of Krugman's program. Over 700 children had been deliberately infected with hepatitis between 1956 and 1967. The research had expanded beyond hepatitis to include other infectious diseases. Children were being used to test experimental vaccines, antibiotics, and therapeutic procedures. Willowbrook had become America's largest human experimentation facility and the medical establishment. New Krugman's research was funded by the National Institutes of Health. His protocols were reviewed by ethics committees at NYU. His findings were published in the most prestigious medical journals in the world. The entire system was complicit, but public opinion was beginning to shift. The civil rights movement had awakened America's conscience about human dignity and equal protection. Parents of disabled children were organizing, demanding better treatment for their children, and journalists were starting to pay attention. In 1965, a young reporter named Geraldo Rivera was assigned to cover conditions at Willowbrook for WABC-TV in New York. What he found there would launch his career and destroy Krugman's. Rivera's cameras captured images that shocked the American public. Children living in their own filth. Teenagers rocking endlessly in empty rooms, their heads bloodied from hitting concrete walls. Staff members who seemed more like prison guards than caregivers. But Rivera also uncovered something even more disturbing. Evidence of medical experimentation. Former staff members spoke anonymously about deliberate infections. Parents shared stories about consent forms they didn't understand. Medical students like Bronston provided documentation of the research protocols. The story broke in January 1972 with Rivera's television expose Willowbrook, the last great disgrace. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Protests erupted outside Willowbrook. Parent advocacy groups demanded investigations. Politicians called for hearings. Medical ethicists questioned how such research could have been approved and funded for so many years. Krugman initially defended his work. In interviews, he insisted that the research had been ethical and necessary. He pointed to the medical advances that had resulted from the studies. He argued that the children had received better care in the research unit than they would have received in the general population. "We saved more lives than we harmed," he told reporters, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Internal documents revealed that Krugman had known from the beginning that he was deliberately infecting healthy children. Consent forms were exposed as deceptive and misleading. Parents testified that they had never been told their children would be used as test subjects. Most damning of all were the children themselves. Now adults, Some were able to speak for themselves about what had happened to them. They described being forced to drink medicine that made them sick. They remembered being taken for special tests that involved injections and blood draws. They talked about the fear and confusion of being sick and not understanding why. Their testimony broke the hearts of everyone who heard it. But perhaps the most chilling revelation came from Krugman's own research notes, obtained through court proceedings. In clinical, detached language, he had documented every aspect of the children's suffering. He had recorded their pain levels, their symptoms, their recovery times, all as if they were laboratory animals rather than human beings. One entry, dated March 15, 1963, read, Subject 127 male, age 7. Moderate retardation shows excellent response to hepatitis B infection. Jaundice progression, ideal for study purposes. Recommend similar dosage for future subjects in this age category. Subject 127 had a name, Tommy Morrison. He had been brought to Willowbrook by parents, who hoped the doctors there could help him learn to tie his shoes and say his own name. Instead, they made him sick for science. The legal consequences came swiftly. In 1972, the federal government filed a lawsuit against New York State, demanding immediate reforms at Willowbrook. A consent decree was signed requiring massive improvements in conditions and care. But for the children who had been used as test subjects, justice was harder to find. Many had died over the years, their deaths attributed to complications from natural hepatitis infections. Others had suffered long-term liver damage that would affect them for the rest of their lives. All had been traumatized by experiences they didn't understand and couldn't consent to. Krugman retired from active research in 1973, though he continued to defend his work until his death in 1995. He never apologized to the families he had deceived, or the children he had harmed. Noyu conducted an internal review of the research and concluded that, while the studies might not meet current ethical standards, they had been appropriate for their time. It was a conclusion that satisfied no one and helped nothing. The medical community struggled to come to terms with what had happened. How had such obviously unethical research been approved and funded for so many years? How had the medical establishment failed so completely in its duty to protect vulnerable patients? The answers were uncomfortable but clear. The system had failed, because it had never really seen these children as fully human. Their disability made them disposable. Their poverty made them expendable. Their isolation made them invisible, and their vulnerability made them perfect victims. But here's the part of the story that will keep you awake at night. Krugman's research worked. The hepatitis vaccine that protects millions of children today. It was developed using data from the Willowbrook experiments, the blood screening protocols that prevents hepatitis transmission through transfusions. They came from Krugman's research. Our understanding of viral hepatitis, which has saved countless lives, it was built on the suffering of those children. Medical progress often has a dark side, but rarely one this dark. Krugman knew his research would lead to medical breakthroughs. He knew it would save lives. He also knew it would cause suffering for the children in his care. He chose to prioritize the potential future benefits over the definite present harm, and the medical establishment agreed with him. This wasn't rogue research conducted by a madman in secret. This was mainstream medical science, funded by the federal government, approved by ethics committees, published in prestigious journals, and celebrated by the medical community. The real horror of Willowbrook isn't that one. Doctor lost his moral compass. It's that an entire system decided that some lives were worth more than others. But the twists in this story go even deeper. In 1976, just 4 years after the Willowbrook scandal broke, Dr. Baruch Blumberg won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his work on hepatitis B. His research, which led to the development of the hepatitis B vaccine, relied heavily on data and viral samples from Krugman's experiments. The Nobel Committee never acknowledged the connection. Blumberg never mentioned the children of Willowbrook in his acceptance speech. The medical establishment had found a way to keep the benefits while forgetting the costs. And here's perhaps the most chilling revelation: Willowbrook wasn't unique. As investigations into the scandal deepened, reporters and researchers uncovered similar experiments at institutions across the country. Children with disabilities had been used as test subjects for everything from experimental vaccines to radiation exposure studies to psychological conditioning experiments. The Fanold School in Massachusetts fed radioactive oatmeal to children to study nutrition absorption. The Sonoma State Hospital in California exposed children to painful experimental procedures. The Pennhurst State School in Pennsylvania used residents as subjects for drug testing. Willowbrook was just the tip of the iceberg. For decades, America had been conducting medical experiments on its most vulnerable citizens: children with disabilities, elderly people in nursing homes, prisoners, patients in mental hospitals. Anyone who couldn't say no became a potential research subject. The medical establishment called it progress. History calls it what it was: systematic abuse disguised as science. But perhaps the most disturbing twist of all is how little has really changed. Today, medical research is supposedly governed by strict ethical guidelines developed in response to scandals like Willowbrook. Informed consent is required. Independent review boards evaluate research proposals. Vulnerable populations receive special protections. Yet medical researchers continue to find ways to exploit the vulnerable. Pharmaceutical companies test drugs in developing countries where regulations are weak and populations desperate. Clinical trials often target poor communities where people can't afford to refuse participation. Children in foster care are still used as subjects for psychiatric drug research. The methods have become more sophisticated, but the underlying logic remains the same. Some people's suffering is acceptable if it served the greater good, and society continues to look the way. The children of Willowbrook taught us that medical progress without moral progress is just sophisticated barbarism. Their suffering showed us that good intentions can justify any atrocity if we're not careful about who gets to decide what's good. But we've chosen to remember their contributions to science while forgetting their names, their faces, and their pain. That might be the cruelest experiment of all. Willowbrook State School closed in 1987. The buildings stand empty now, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Ivy creeps up the walls where children once lived. Windows that once held desperate faces now reflect only sky. But the lessons of Willowbrook remain achingly relevant. Every time we hear about a new medical breakthrough, we should ask, who paid the price? Every time we celebrate scientific progress, we should remember, someone's suffering made this possible. The children of Willowbrook didn't choose to be heroes of medical science. They were chosen for them by doctors who decided their lives were worth less than the knowledge that could be gained from their suffering. Dr. Saul Krugman died in 1995, still convinced he had done the right thing. In his final interviews, he expressed no regret about the hepatitis experiments. He pointed to the lives saved by the vaccines his research helped develop. He insisted that the greater good had been served. He never apologized to a single family, but some of the children survived. Some lived to tell their stories. Some found ways to forgive what was done to them, even if they could never forget. And their voices remind us of the most important truth to emerge from the ashes of Willowbrook. Medical progress means nothing if we lose our humanity in the pursuit of it. The next time you hear about a promising new treatment or a breakthrough vaccine, remember the children who made it possible. Remember that every medical advance has a human cost. And ask yourself, are we still making the same mistakes? Because somewhere, in some institution we don't think about, some researcher is probably deciding that the ends justify the means, that progress requires sacrifice, that some lives matter more than others. The only question is, will we stop them this time? Or will we once again choose convenience over conscience, progress over protection, the future over the present? The children of Willowbrook can't answer that question for us, but their ghosts are still waiting for our reply. What do you think? Were the doctors at Willowbrook monsters, or were they products of a system that dehumanized disability? Should medical progress ever come at the cost of individual consent and dignity? Let me know in the comments below, and if this story moved you, share it. These children's stories deserve to be told. Their suffering deserves to be remembered, and their legacy deserves to change how we think about medicine, ethics, and what it means to be human. Because forgetting the children of Willowbrook would be the cruelest experiment of all.